Hello everyone and welcome to today's event. My name is Philippa Duthie and I am the Director of the RSA's Oceania Network. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Collectively, we stand in footsteps millennia old. Wherever you're joining from today, please join me in acknowledging the elders and traditional custodians of all the places represented here today, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land. We humbly thank them for their generosity and wisdom and pay our respects to ancestors and descendants. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second event in our series, Reclaiming the Future, co-hosted by RSA Oceania and the RSA Sustainability Network. Humanity has reached a critical inflection point. Our myopic fixation on the short term is threatening the long-term survival of our species and our planet. Now, more than ever, we urgently need to expand our time perspectives to think, dream, and plan for the long term. In this series, we look at how we can nurture our ability to think long and create a culture of intergenerational and planetary responsibility. In our last session, we were joined by Roman Krznaric, who spoke about the drivers of short-termism and outlined 6 ways that we can cultivate a long-term mindset and become good ancestors. Today, we will explore the connection between time and place. How we relate to the long term is deeply influenced by our cultural perceptions of time and is shaped by our relationship with the land and with each other. To guide us through this discussion on how we can be better stewards of the earth in the present and for the future, we are incredibly privileged to be joined by 2 wonderful speakers, Professor of Indigenous Knowledge and Design Thinker, Professor Norm Sheehan, and regenerative practitioner and system resetter, Alana Marsh. For those of you who attended last time, you'll know that I'm hoping to start each of these sessions with a short excerpt just to fire up our temporal imaginations. So today's quote comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a botanist, a very celebrated botanist, an Indigenous thinker as well, and a poet and a writer and a teacher and many other things besides. And she says that the story of our relationship to the earth is written more truthfully on the land than on the page. It lasts there. The land remembers what we said and what we did. Stories are among our most potent tools for restoring the land, as well as our relationship to land. We need to unearth the old stories that live in place and begin to create new ones. For we are story makers, not just storytellers. All stories are connected, new ones woven from the threads of the old. In many Indigenous ways of knowing, time is not a river, but a lake in which the past, the present, and the future coexist. Creation, then, is an ongoing process, and the story is not history alone. It is also prophecy. As the world changes, an immigrant culture must write its own new stories of relationship to place, tempered by the wisdom of those who are old on this land long before we came. And that quote was from Braiding Sweetgrass, which I recommend to everybody here. You should definitely buy it. It's an amazing book, or better yet, I would listen to the audiobook because the way she says it is incredibly beautiful, much more beautiful than my reading. But the second passage comes from her essay, Returning the Gift, which is equally wonderful. And she says that if we are to persist as a species on this beautiful planet, the next step in our cultural evolution is to expand our protocols for gratitude to the living earth. Gratitude provides an opening to reciprocity, to the act of giving back, to living in a way that the earth will be grateful for us. So some words to guide us today on our journey. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today's event, Professor Norm Sheehan. Professor Sheehan is a Wiradjuri man born in Mudgee, New South Wales. He is a collaborative leader in Aboriginal community development and Aboriginal higher education, a Professor of Indigenous Knowledge, and a leading design thinking practitioner. He is recognised as contributing significantly to the development of Indigenous knowledge as an academic discipline and is responsible for the development of the first Australian Bachelor degree of Indigenous Knowledge and Doctoral degree of Indigenous Philosophies. Norm, welcome.
Thank you. I'm speaking on Quandamooka country here in Queensland, southeast Queensland. So I'd start by showing all respect to the country that sustains us here, beautiful, and to the countries where all business is situated. I think I'll start with a little story. My work as an academic, working as an Aboriginal academic in Australia is quite an interesting thing. It's interesting in the sense of living in interesting times. It's always a fairly diverse sort of little experience. I'm going to also mention the names of a few people who have passed away, so warning in advance about that if you know them. But this particular uncle that I worked with when I was Dean of the Aboriginal College, Ginnaby College, was a great supporter for me in many ways. He came from very close country to me and supported me a great deal. And the first time that I went to him for assistance, he told me a story. And the story was about a 1924 DeSoto utility, which is a very old car from America, rebuilt into a utility in Australia sometime in the 1920s. And he bought it for £4. And he bought it in a town called Cunnamulla, which is in far western Queensland, to drive to a new job he had about 200 kilometres away. And he soon found out, as he said to me, every time we hit a bump, the thing got a puncture. And so he said, I drove out of town, got a puncture, got out, fixed it, drove a few more kilometres, got another puncture, got out and fixed it. And he said, me being stupid, took me a long time to realise the punctures were on the inner side of the tube. And he rattled the wheels and he found out the tube was being punctured by the loose spokes in the rim. Every time it hit a bump or he hit the brake, there was a puncture. He said, by that time, he said it was so far from town that it was just keep on going and keep on repairing. So he'd drive a little bit, stop, fix it, drive a little bit, stop, fix it. And he said it took him 3 or 4 days, but he got there to his new job. First thing he did when he got paid was get a new car. And his story helped me a great deal as the Dean of an Aboriginal College in an Australian university, because there's a lot of repair work all the time in a job like that. And the punctures are caused by a particular looseness that I think has origins that I'll talk about a little bit. Those origins are very much part of the fabric of modern society. And thinking and writing about such things, I looked at Miller's work about the doctrine of discovery and the Papal Bull of 1493, which said to Western Europeans, anywhere you go, all you have to go there to do is go there and you own it. You own the whole world, as long as you're converting peoples to belief in Christ. As long as you're following the orders of the Catholic Church, as it's known, then everywhere you go, you own it. So we have, the papal monarchy in South America through the Spanish speaking peoples, Portuguese overseas, and all the other empires that grew out of Western Europe. And basically, infected the whole earth. So my understanding about this is fairly limited. Wonderful Aboriginal professor, Larissa Barent, is part of that group that wrote the Doctrine of Discovery. It opens your mind up to why people believe they're non-Indigenous. And I think that that's the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about what all of this means in my terms. That work that Aboriginal people do in Australia, constantly working through very, very difficult structures, because the structures have conditions that I think need to be and can be understood. So when I look at all that, there's something about the doctrine of discovery that gets me thinking about ontology, gets me thinking about what sort of assumptions we have about the nature of the world and the nature of humans. And the first thing about this entire doctrine is that the world has no meaning in and of itself. And I call it the eternal elsewhere. The drive of colonialism meant that people would go to a place, none of the knowledge there had any meaning. None of the landscapes had any real significance. In fact, in Australia, there's thousands of Lake Windermeres because everything was named after features that people remembered from the home country. Meanwhile, Aboriginal knowledge was just overlooked, swept aside, and wherever it could be, it was destroyed. So the knowledge in place was insignificant as well. And the earth being just mere matter, that was a vehicle for believers to make the transition through the world to heaven, which is somewhere else. Now, that's not the original Christian religion in my understanding either, but it is the spiritual driving force behind colonialism. And over time, it also has become the driving force behind development, where nothing has significance except the progression of things that are valuable to some. So looking at that progression over many decades, I see there's two things that are part of that. The first is, what sort of assumption must a person have about themselves to believe in this progress? And I take Spencer's view that it's not possible not to have assumptions about the nature of the world and our being in it. Our being in the world is driven by assumptions. The assumptions that are shared are very, very much part and parcel of the makeup of a people, continued culturally. They pre-frame thought before thoughts occur. So the assumptive base of the people is a very, very difficult thing to shift and change. And you'll find that the world is very, very adept at going to war to protect these assumptions or to impose the assumptions on somebody else. This seems to be the cycle. But the assumptions themselves are rarely spoken about. Indeed, the most powerful assumptive bases never need to be spoken at all. They're silent. The most silent ones are the ones that are carried by colonists in places like Australia. You can read books like Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, and it's a litany not just of Aboriginal ability and technology, it's a litany of the refusal to see the disregard that Aboriginal people suffered under English colonialism. And you'll see the same in South America. So this idea of an assumptive base is the crucial point to what we're talking about in terms of long-term views. Also, I wrote back in 2010 with a group of colleagues, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal colleagues, a paper called, or a chapter called, Denatured Spirit, Social Design and Neo-Colonialism. Now, Denatured Spirit actually comes from one of my colleagues, Janine Dunleavy, and she worked as a milk tester in the butter factory. And denatured spirit, as you know, is methylated spirits. And we looked at the blindness that comes from drinking methylated spirits, something that a lot of our old people did, the illnesses that come from that. And then we looked at the blindness of the mainstream and the refusal to regard Aboriginal things as being of any value. And that disregard, that ability to disregard, is something like the loose spokes in that wheel. The loose spokes in that wheel operate against the natural turning of a wheel. And my proposal is that short-term thinking is a social design. Social design that means that it's easy to forget what you've done. In fact, Janine used to call it the Great Australian Forgettery. It's hard to remember what the origin of all these problems are, because there's a huge amount of violence and trauma. Aboriginal people find it very hard to forget, whereas there are systems to help people in the mainstream not remember. And that's one of the things that I think is part of a social system that has, I guess, an ontological design feature. Violence breeds this sort of forgetfulness. Now, I'm a person whose father was a veteran of the Second World War. He fought in Europe. And as a young child, when he had his turns from war neuroses, I would sit and listen to him. And he would tell me amazing stories. He never spoke about violence or bloodshed, but he talked about the dances and the fun times and the drink. And so, again, the idea of remembering is a very, very difficult thing. And when it is remembering, it becomes very ceremonial and it becomes very angst-filled and emotional. So this burden means that there's a disconnect there. Another story that I can tell is about Billy. So as a young man, I worked on the Western Plains as a farmer, sharecropper sometimes, but mostly working for other people. And one of the most beautiful things that you can see is Billy. It's called the rainbow bee-eater. It's a wonderful bird. It nests out there in the Western Plains in burrows in the ground. It burrows into the ground, lays its eggs, and the end of every January each year, it flies out and all the way up through Cape York to either far north Queensland, Cape York, across to New Guinea. And there was a big nest of those birds up the road from me. I used to watch them and enjoy them every day. Many, many years later, I was embroiled in a conflict locally with Torres Strait Islander mob. And I had helped them develop a program at the university, and there was a bit of a problem. It was a bit of a change of the guard. And people said, oh, you know, you can't be teaching Torres Strait stuff. And I said, I don't teach Torres Strait stuff. I bring in people to do that work, of course. And they said, but there's no relation between you and us. And I said, yes, there is. There's bitter. And they knew the word because the word is the noise that the bird makes. And they said, how do you know that? And I said, well, where I grew up, that's where it nests. And we had a big long yarn. We sat down and we spoke. And all the problems were eased because there's a connection there that's cultural and understood by both sides. So the idea of things being short-term, conflict-based, is actually quite a solid thing to say that there's an ontological base to what we did when we negotiated in that space. The first thing that we have to understand is that our assumptions about the nature of the world are the things that play out. I've got a wonderful group of students that are teaching me a lot these days. They're still hanging around, still teaching me, and I'm still trying to learn. One of the young bright ones is a guy called Sheldon Harrington. And his thesis said, you know, it's simpler than that. He said, doing explains everything. And I was greatly impressed by this, because if you have a long-term view and you find suddenly one day that there's a pandemic and it's viruses that come from bats that have made the jump through other mammals in a wet market to humans and then spread around the world and killed millions, you would say, what has been done to make this possible? And the first thing that I think of is that animals have been disrespected. And if you disrespect animals for a very long time and don't take knowledge from the way animals operate, then things like pandemics will occur. It's the same as I have a very separated family. I've got kids in Darwin and in Perth, as well as in New South Wales and Brisbane. And the flight of a jet aeroplane. Nobody talks about jet aeroplanes, more than 2,000 flights a day, 200,000 flights a day. And each second, over a tonne of air comes out of each engine at 500 to 1,000 degrees. And people complain about that's a second, and the average flight is 3 hours and 50 minutes. And people complain about global warming, and yet there's all these heaters flying around. We tend not to see some things. And in that tendency not to see, we have global warming, we have global change, and that's called, you know, the anthropocene. If you look at, there's a report coming out on the state of the environment. And that report will show a picture of the environment in Australia in 1750, modelled backwards from the present day. And it's an absolutely pristine environment. But that is not seen as the Anthropocene. It's not seen as humans interacting with environments, when all us Aboriginal people here know that that pristine country, not wilderness, country, was formed by our understanding with nature over many thousands of years. So the idea of how do you get long-term thinking? Long-term thinking comes from basic assumptions. And I've thought a bit about this, and my elders have taught me quite a bit about this over the time, because really we're all very young. We have to have assumptions about the world. And the first assumption that I put forward about country is that it's alive, it's intelligent, and it responds. So country is alive, intelligent, and responds. And we don't test the truth of that assumption because we know it plays out generationally. It plays out generationally, and we know the truth of what we've done in 7 or 8 generations' time. The idea that truth is something that's made valid by the discussion of humans is starting to be eroded by the fact that the climate is speaking, country is speaking and saying, you cannot sustain yourselves. And that is the result of generations, just a few generations of mistreatment. So looking at our assumptions, the first thing we have to do is treat country as just as alive as humans and much, much smarter than humans. The other thing is it exists long, long after we're gone, and it exists for our great-great-grandchildren. These things Indigenous people have always said. So the shift in assumptions is what changes these things, in my view. And that shift, I think, is already happening because events like this are happening. So I think I'll end there. And
that was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Norm. Wonderful, wonderful insight. I'm now delighted to welcome our second speaker for tonight, Alana Marsh. Alana is a Miriam woman, a Torres Strait Islander who grew up on mainland Australia, Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, and now lives on Wiradjuri country in Melbourne, Victoria. She has worked in project management across 2 levels of government and now devotes her energy to system resetting and sharing the Earth Connection practice of Wayapa work. Wayapa is a wellness modality that enables the transmission of intergenerational well-being by deepening our individual and collective reciprocity with our shared mother, Mother Earth. She is also on the steering committee for Regenerative Songlines Australia, which is working to create a continent-wide network that connects regenerative projects and practitioners. Alana, welcome.
Thank you, Philippa. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. And I'm going to make a little assumption about the group as well, and that you will be happy to join me as we send some collective love and gratitude down to the earth, particularly for the people in Australia. I really am very much aware that there was so much song, dance, ceremony and ritual that, nourished that collective mother, over thousands and thousands of years. And, we have an opportunity as contemporary custodians to send that love and gratitude down to the earth, that vibration, And, I think of Dr. Anne Polina, one of the women on the steering group for the Regenerative Songlines, and she often speaks about how, and as Norm, said as well, that, the land, the planet, country will go on, long after our species potentially, is not here anymore, but it'll be lonely. It won't have that vibration from us. So just taking a moment to send that vibration down from wherever you are joining the call tonight. Imagine that going down from the soles of your feet through the foundations of the building down to the earth, but it also goes out into the air from your skin. We know that the skin makes us think that we're solid and that we're separate, but it's actually a it's one of those assumptions that aren't true. So as you're drawing that breath in, inhaling that nourishment from a place that you love, and sending that back out with the exhalation. And that's the reciprocity that is just one small demonstration of the reciprocity that Aboriginal people across our continent lived in harmony with that collective mother for thousands of years. So I want to pay respects to all the Australians, all the people from overseas that have joined, and welcome you into this space as contemporary custodians. And I think, we have some amazing work to do in terms of weaving together the way forward. And while we want to hasten, and get that sorted, it's not a thing that we should be rushing to do as well, because we don't often make good decisions. We're not often coming from a place of clarity when we're feeling that stress and that anxiety. So, really reminding people to continue that breath work as they navigate through life. As Philippa said, I'm a Miriam woman. My grandparents left the Torres Strait in the 1950s, and I was born on Mamu country up near Innisfail in far north Queensland. But I grew up on Bundjalung country, and I moved down here to Melbourne on land that Woiwurrung speakers lived, loved and laughed on, for thousands of years in 2005. And I feel very blessed, very nourished in that journey down the east coast of Australia. And being in Melbourne in particular, it's brought me into contact, with Waiapa work, which is a wellness modality that allows the transmission of intergenerational well-being by reconnecting people back to the earth. We know the earth as the enabling platform for mind, body, spirit wellness within individuals, which also informs the well-being of communities, of nation states, and it makes a contribution to planetary health as well. So it's been birthed down here in Victoria, and it's a contemporary way of reconnecting to the earth using 14 readily recognised elements. And it's a really powerful tool because, we tend to treat the things that we love, the things that we're connected to well. And, we feel that this whole disconnection that we have happening and, the 30-second soundbite, the visual society that we live in, all these cues and drivers, the many triggers that we experience in modernity has, turned some people away. They get overwhelmed and, potentially lose hope around some of the climate chaos that's happening. Other people, get burnt out through that whole process. And we really invite people to slow down, have a somatic reset. We have a movement sequence that goes with those 14 elements that connects people, across the two hemispheres of the earth. And, I think, the fact that it's the spring equinox for us here in Australia at the moment, and the fact that, it's the autumn equinox over on the other side of the world. And, that's a really potent thing that we can't find. We just don't have that visibility. We don't have that elevation of those knowledges. And, that's a sign of the disconnection. So Waiapa is an amazing modality, and a lot of the stuff that comes from government or the media about Aboriginal Australia tells you that it's it's very trauma informed, and it's we've got to close the gap, and it's a problem. And I feel so excited about having this strength-based message to help people connect into some of those wisdoms and strengths that Uncle Norm spoke about earlier. and that, we have a potential to do a new weave. I think colonization landed with a almighty impact on this country and on its First Peoples. And, I'm seeing the growing appetite, the growing activities, the things that are happening to actually, create that balance and harmony that we need to move forward. And the earth is the container. Country is the container for that. It's the first law. The interdependence and how the stories, how the ways of knowing, being, and doing have been expressed on country, how they continue to be expressed on country. It is the container for our existence. And, it's that fresh air, it's that clean air. And we all have a layer of insight and knowledge that we will be able to enjoy with that. But we all have a connection to it. So we all have a potential and we all have a responsibility around helping direct our species back to be more of a steward of the earth. I'm, so excited to be part of the steering group for the Regenerative Songlines project. And, I really think, I was, sort of wondering how did this sort of fall into my lap? And, I think it was probably about 9 years ago, I had 2 strokes in the part of your brain that maintains the systems of your body, so at the top of the brain stem. And, it really turned my and my family's life upside down. And, we've been writing ourselves, but that knowledge around systems, really came through to me. Oh, you need to check this out a bit more. You need to understand how that all works. So I had that prompt, and it was connected to Waiapa. There was the 2 Australian co-hosts of the Regenerative Practitioner series came to a Waiapa immersion that I was doing here in Melbourne. And somehow it's been, woven into that whole fabric of who I am. And, the thing that I, really love about that is that everybody has a contribution to make. And, that relational responsibility is very much balanced by the relational nourishment and guidance that we can get, from that work that we do and how it informs us. So it's never a problem or this is too hard, or it's too many people trying to contact me, or whatever it might be, because there's such nourishment that you receive within from doing that work. So we have songlines across the whole planet. I know the Camino Trail in Spain, it's been described to me as a songline. There are songlines, probably, where those birds that Uncle Norm spoke about, traveling from, Wiradjuri country up to PNG, may have followed a songline. And, I live in this very urban setting, and I have just had this thought, someone said to me, how do we connect to country when all we can see is, buildings and cement and things like that? And I remember being at the Sofitel in Melbourne, and I looked out across, and all I could see was, air conditioning units and plumes of looked like steam. I don't really know what it was, but going up into the air, and cranes. And I thought, oh, that's pretty sobering. And then I looked down to the ground, and you could see the Birrarung, so the Yarra River that goes out to the sea. And there were this flock of white birds that were flying over the river. And I thought, wow, that's really beautiful, because those birds have probably taken that path out to the ocean for thousands and thousands of years. And so, we might have to look a little bit harder to find those connection points, but they're still there. And, it's, I think it's, part of the challenge, and also the opportunity of living in a place where we had an earthquake here in Melbourne yesterday, which, some of you I know are from Melbourne, and like Jane, so hi Jane, but, it really gives us that reminder, those things, the shifting tectonic plates, and, that we are just one part of this amazing biosphere. And, we like to think that we control a lot, but we really don't control, very much at all. And things like earthquakes really, really remind us of that. And, I think, we have to, I think it's important to recognize that, climate change is something that's been going on forever. living systems never actually get locked down and remain static. But we as humans, as a species, we have actually accelerated the speed in which it's happening. So it's happening at a pace that's, potentially going to see us divulged from the planet, because we're not actually really good for it. And when I think about that, those ideas of deep time, I'm really reminded of the age of the planet. It's about 4.5 billion years old, and our species emerged not even a million years ago. I don't even know how long that is, but I know we are the most recent additions, and we're the ones that are wearing out our welcome. And there's such wisdoms from Aboriginal First Nations people across the world around that reciprocity, being in harmony, living based on need, not on greed, that there is no room for extractive processes that or resource extraction, because we're actually taking it from ourselves. May not be our generation, but it will definitely be generations of the future. So I believe some scientists have actually saying we have reached a tipping point, or already reached that tipping point, but we know that it's either very close or it has been reached, or so we have this amazing opportunity to pull together as a species to remedy some of these things. And that weaving that we can do between some of those ancient wisdoms, some of those self-evident truths, along with new and existing technologies, and activation of will for those people that are just overwhelmed with it all, or have switched off, or just want to keep their heads down and their focus down on their phones or whatever it might be. We need to somehow awaken them to the whole core of the earth, and be guided by those different ways of knowing, being, and doing. And when I think about Aboriginal Australia and my 30 or 40 years of working closely with Aboriginal individuals and families and communities, I just continually am blown away by the governance, the sophistication of how those communities lived in reciprocity with themselves, with others, with the waters, with the country, with the air, with the sky. Such an amazing potential and responsibility that we particularly have here in Australia as contemporary custodians of that way of knowing, being, and doing. And potentially, I think some really profound messages for humanity, for the rest of the world, from here in Australia as well. So that's just my introduction of self, and I'm really excited to connect with you more. And I really love the opportunity to be part of conversations where we push the edges out a little bit more. Often modernity likes us to stay in our lane, and we know that systems, artificial systems, thrive on conformity and people staying within their lanes and being able to predict how it will react, and it'll have to do the same thing, follow that algorithm for so that the system maintains its integrity. But living systems actually welcomes and celebrates the diversity that exists. Everybody has a contribution to make, and we need everybody to be contributing. And that speaks about the interdependence between the species and the water and the sky as well. That the humans aren't at the top of the hierarchy. There is no hierarchy. It's a system that relies on that interdependence and that relational aspect. I think I might leave it there, because I feel like I just get machine gun stuff out to people. So sorry if I've been blah.
No, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Alana. That was I think you just about answered all the questions that I'd prepared. So once again, I'm doing a shout out to the audience to please contribute to some questions, because both of our speakers have raised some amazing and challenging insights, I think, that all of us need to grapple with. I feel we almost need time to grapple with all that you've both said. But I'm going to try and pick up on just a few, particularly a few things that both of you have mentioned, which is, as you said, that notion of relationships and how we can better connect with with the earth, with country, with our natural surroundings. And I was reading an article recently. It's I want to say it's Robin Wall Kimmerer's, because this sounds like something she would say, but it was about the relationships that we have with each other and the time that we invest in our personal relationships, with children, with our family, etc. We spend a lot of our time investing in those relationships, but we don't seem to spend that dedicated time and energy in investing in our relationship with the earth, our true mother. So I just wondered what your thoughts were around this, and if that's perhaps an entryway into reconsidering our connection to the earth.
I think I could have a quick go, and then Uncle Norm might want to say something. But I was thinking about when you were talking that when colonizers came here and they didn't recognize the sophistication and the ways of governance and the way that society was structured, and just the fact that we had over 250 language groups here on this continent coexisting in harmony. There was never people taking over other people's land. It was so it was just an amazing setup just from the beginning there within that. And I think about how I hear that prior to colonization, taking care of what we would consider to be the main business of living, going to work, securing sustenance for our families, probably only took 2 or 3 hours a day. So there was a lot of other time left for other things. And so, I think maybe that's where the perception of being lazy came in, which is, such a wrong thing. But when I sort of learned more and understood that, that time was actually used for ceremony, it was used for that intimate connection with place, with country. If, say, for example, like down here in Victoria, kangaroos are used, all parts of the kangaroo are used. So the kangaroo sinew from the tail sews the possum skin cloaks together that people use for warmth. But, any bones were used for other things as well. So it was really about honoring the life of that kangaroo. And, that very, this is what you're doing for us. This is what I'm doing in response back to you. And there would have been ceremony around different times of year, helping the whales come in, when they need to birth their babies, ensuring that there's a good season for, the bogong moths, whatever it might be. There would have been all of this time. And so I feel like, we've been sort of not duped, but, the whole work ethic thing and the Industrial Revolution, like I think it's got a lot to answer for, because, our time went out the window. We were unable to, potentially do that. And it's potentially hard for us to do that today in modernity. Like what do we do? But, everybody can have the connection with their local place. I don't know if I've answered your question, Philippa, but I think...
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Norm, did you want to weigh in with some thoughts of yours as well?
Yeah, thank you. Non-destructive lives, opportunities to engage with country and build knowledge builds a strong mob through inside learning. Nobody tests you. What you do explains what you know. So these really simple, basic things, what you do, if you're working in the places that these people, this institution that you work for, if you're working towards these objectives, you're doing is good. It explains your identity. And quite often people get waylaid into thinking that these things aren't real, or they're esoteric, or they're spiritual. They're actually very, very practical. Lana's very correct in saying that the songlines are everywhere, and that rainbow Beata, that line that goes from down around Murray-Darling in the far west all the way up through to New Guinea is a line. There's many of them. And those connections, they're connections of kinship between animals and communities and countries. So what is there is numerous connections and pathways, and they're all related, layered relational understandings in country. So these ideas are somewhat simple to say. They're really, really difficult to live through.
Yes, very much so. It's so amazing to get your insights into it. We had a conversation last week with Roman Krznaric, who wrote a book called The Good Ancestor, which was kind of the basis for this series. And he speaks a lot about the concept of empathy. So cultivating empathy with future generations as a way to combat this, myopic short-termism that we seem to find ourselves in these days. But it seems to me that what we're talking about now is more about respect, respect for place, respect for connections, respect for relationships. And I just wanted to get your thoughts around that, because, coming to this with a respectful attitude, with an understanding that we are all students, that we need to learn from each other, but mostly from the earth, seems a good starting place to kind of come to a collective understanding to help us even begin to contemplate, our future as a species. So I just wanted to get your thoughts around that.
There's a concept, a Wiradjuri concept called Yingyamara. You can find that if you search for YINDYAMARRA. It's a couple of brilliant people have put that Yingyamara concept on paper through Charles Sturt University. That concept is about respect as the basis for all being, and respect for Mother Earth and the creator spirits and the pathways that are there. That idea of respect. Also, if you look at some of our great leaders, I particularly Uncle Kevin Gilbert, who's long past now, but his Living Black book back in 1977, he said, Aboriginal people, we respect because we maintain our difference. We don't take up the violations of our oppressors. We don't take up arms. We don't behave in the same way as colonists. We keep ourselves respectful. And there's amazing power in facing somebody who's violating and just maintaining your respect. And that sort of stuff, that sort of long-term thinking means you don't fly into conflict. You sit back and you watch and you see how things move. And if something is causing you punches every 10 minutes, you fix them. That idea of cultures of repair that Tristan Schultz has put forward, and his brother Clinton as well. Cultures of repair. We need to develop cultures that repair what we've done in the past. It's the only way forward.
Totally agree as well. And I think that the role of healing is something that's, so needed. And, it's, led and informed by a lot of different perspectives. And, I think about, is it Professor Mary Graham? Is she a professor?
She is, yes.
Sorry, yeah, we call her Auntie Professor.
Auntie Professor Mary Graham. She has been, putting out really good messages around, there's that law of the land, the first law, and then the expression of that at the human level is autonomous regard. So I think if you were to Google autonomous regard, it talks about how, we have autonomy as individuals to be self-regulating, to move in that world, but we have a respect and a care for the others that are around us, and we understand that our survival is linked to having that good relationship with them. And so I think that's a really potent thing to understand as well. But I think that each of these nations around Aboriginal nations around Australia would have had their own governance or ideas or ways of having this work. And that's I think some people can be mistaken and think, oh, this is the Aboriginal word for such and such, or there's such diversity there amongst this continent. I think it's a really important thing to understand. But there are some universal truths, some universal principles, some values, some ways of living that connect all of them. And I remember I was at this thing once with Bruce Pascoe, and Uncle Norm, you've spoken about him before, and he was talking about a creation story, or a story that he said is amongst a number of these different groups around the country, and they're connected by songlines, so it's no real surprise. But he was talking about the rainbow serpent and the whale, and that the whale actually sensed that there was going to be some tension over land, or could have this foreboding sense of some sort of conflict. So it was at the time a land walking creature, and thought, oh, this is not good. I will actually remove myself from this point of potential conflict, and that's why it went into the water. And we know that whales have pelvic cradles, these particular whales it just shows the length of time of the stories that guide how Aboriginal people know and be and do. That you have these principles, these stories from animals, and there's not heaps of stories that I'm aware of in modernity that we give the same reverence to the animals and the plants, the water and the sky, as what those ancient wisdoms that are still very much alive today do.
Alana, I'm just trying to pick up on some of the questions that we've got in the chat, and once again, I encourage everyone to ask your questions as we come to the last 20 minutes of the event. One of the comments was around a lot of one of our participants wanted to know more about Waiapa and more about how those practices can help people to just connect with the long term in a more substantial manner and connect with place and country.
So as I was saying, we use 14 readily recognized elements, and they're all really potent in terms of what they offer. But I really love the creator element, which is the first element, and that idea that we need to activate reciprocity with the energy that is around us, and it will nourish us and guide us and inform us. But the thing that we need to do before we can actually really, I think, fully or go part of the way to making that real, is to really connect in with the essence of who we are and have a very intimate connection with what it means for us in our context, within our family, within our local area, to be an intentional link in the chain of humanity. So, we've talked about 7 and 8 generations here, and that's a really powerful understanding to know that it's not all upon us. We are guided by 7 generations back. We are hopefully informed by what we think our future generations would like us to have happen. And I always think about, I think my future generations would want to enjoy the same options in life that I have, to be able to see the same species that I might see when I'm out walking in the bush, or that sort of thing. So having that intimate relationship with the essence of who we are and understanding where it's located within country, I think is a really profound thing. And the last element of Waiapa is the child. And as children, we navigate so many firsts, and we're not afraid to look silly. And sometimes as adults, we don't want to look silly any longer. And, that actually starts to close us off from learning. We start to want to appear like we know what's going on. We've got it all under control, but we only know what we'll ever know, what we have just then at that point in time, if we have that approach. And that child element reminds us that, even today, even as adults, we're creating the reality that we are a part of right now. And, we have this inner child within ourselves as well. But, what is the reality that we want to create? What are the decisions that we're making? How are we nurturing our being state to, understand some of these things that will help guide us? And then, what is that reality that we're creating? We create the reality that we want to be a part of. And our children, are a really good way for us to get motivated around getting that into action or into place.
We have in the audience today a number of participants who, of course, are not in the country we now call Australia. Instead, they are, a lot of them are joining in from the UK. And the question is around how people in other countries, non-colonized countries and countries that don't have an Indigenous presence, how do they connect with their ancestors, with, this ancient culture that is present within their nation. So the question is around how do they find their songlines? So I wondered if either of you have any thoughts around that.
I'll say a little bit about that. I've met colleagues from all over the world over the years, and I spent a little bit of a time in New Mexico, which is a really powerful country and some amazing people there. Some places there's anywhere outside of Western Europe, there's places, but I've also met some incredible Celtic and Frisian and Polish, Slavic and Germanic peoples. There's very strong connections to Indigenous pasts everywhere, because when you think about it, probably I guess I go to modern literature for the answer to that. There's always Indians. That's the line from On the Road by Jack Kerouac. There's always Indians. And they just go about their daily thing. Simple people who live simply. There's always people like that. And there's always people close to the earth. And, one of my favourite books is written by a German forester who talks about the being of the forest. That knowledge is always there. It's pushed into the background.
And I was just going to add, I was, doing some work with a organisation, and we were talking about acknowledgements to country. So in Australia, traditional custodians can welcome you onto their country, and anyone can acknowledge country, regardless of your lineage. And he said, I'm originally from Malta. And he said, we've been colonized so many times. I don't know a lot about the history of Malta, but he said, I feel like, my connection to country has been broken. And so I feel like I'm in, being a bit of an imposter when I do that acknowledgement to country. And he had also been, talking to me over a period of weeks, and he was doing a lot of work with the ground, with the soil. And he was, had this huge garden and had this connection, in his home. And I said, well, where you feel it's been lost, or there's been some events that have caused a disconnection, that you are Indigenous to the planet, and the planet would love you to find what is meaningful for you around a songline or a connection to country. And he said, he said, yeah, he totally got that. But, I feel there can be a level of, people wanting to do the right thing or be perfect. And, we have perfection paralysis. And I think that the planet doesn't really want us to let our head get in the way of connecting from our heart.
Thank you so much, Alana. Beautiful words and such an amazing yarn that we're having here today. And I'm sure everyone here feels, yep, there is so much. I'm just echoing a comment that was in the chat, which is we're going to come away tonight with so much, or today for our UK participants, so much to reflect on, so much to think about. So I have time for just a couple more questions, I think. But if there is anything that's on your mind that you want to ask our speakers in the last 10 minutes, please feel free to post also. But my question is around language and story, because this is something that we've picked up on quite a bit throughout the discussion. And I just, I'm curious to know how the words that we use, and not just in relations to the narratives we have told for centuries and hundreds and thousands of years, but or tens of thousands of years, but the language that we use day to day in our modern lives as well influences our perception in terms of our relationships, not just to each other, but to country, but also the way we perceive the future.
Fiddling with the buttons, sorry. Yeah, I think probably the strongest thing about language, I did grow up with family at a young age, but then I spent a long time in Catholic institutions. So, you know, from up to the age of 16. And I actually learnt Latin, as you had to in those days. Very strange language, but very much part of the dogma of the church in those days as well, because it wasn't in English, it was in a language you had to learn, which separated people from any conception of what it was about. When probably I connected up with community again as a young man, I found myself very much in no man's land for a long time. But I went to a place one time with a group of people, and we walked into the forest, and there's an Aboriginal fella talking, and he said, Wiradjuri. And the group of people I was with, everybody's looking around saying, what's this? And I looked straight away, looked up into the trees, because I knew what Wiradjuri meant. And it's koala. And so he looked at me and he came over and he started to talk to me, and connections happened. The idea of learning language as a young man, you would go and see older people and they would tell you. But in those days, Aboriginal language wasn't generally spoken. It was hidden. And the ideas of language being essential to understanding, that's sort of a, you know, that, like Alana said, it's trying to do everything perfectly. You can find the words. Every language has the words. And you find the words, and those words really do make a lot of difference to the person. When you think about Aboriginal languages, they're relational languages. And when we taught about this back when Indigenous knowledge first came out, we used David Boehm's Blackfoot language. He used Native American Blackfoot language, and that's David Boehm, who is a nuclear physicist. He used Blackfoot because that language had a way of talking about things that allowed him to speak about quantum theory, because English limited how he could speak about quantum theory, and he was looking for the language to explain quantum theory to everyday people. So English has its limitations, but as we grow and understand, we change the language. The language is fluent. It changes and flows every time we speak. So that whole idea of it has to be said, you can learn how to speak Aboriginal language. You can learn how to speak the language that you understand with country. Those things, they happen through relationships. They happen because language, if nobody is there, there's nobody to speak to, language is useless. It doesn't exist. Language is a relational thing. It's like images, they're a relational thing. Writing isn't so relational. It's much more internal. But the visual and the spoken and the performed, they're very, very powerful. If you see a person who knows the kangaroo dance do the kangaroo dance, you don't need a book, because everything that you need to know is in the dance and the song. So looking at that, there's a whole range of intelligences, as we all know.
That was amazing. Thank you, Norm. Yeah. So I was going to ask one final question, which came from Susan, which was about us wearing out our welcome. And she's wondering about how to understand hospitality. And I think this is probably a good question to end on. How do we ensure that we're not wearing out our welcome, and how do we cultivate the thankfulness, I suppose, that we need to be a good steward of the earth and a good ancestor to future generations as well.
Is it okay if I go first, Lana?
Absolutely.
I'll finish off. And I was asked to supervise a theology student in, I think it was in Norway or somewhere. And they sent me a brief of their thesis, and their thesis was looking at the ideas of the Godhead in different religions. And I wrote back and said, Bayami is my favourite story about Bayami is the 3-year-old boy. And he couldn't do what all the other children were doing. These are all the creator beings. He was the youngest. And he had stubby little 3-year-old fingers, and he had a stubby little 3-year-old tantrum as well. He ended up, instead of tying the string to a rock to throw, he tied it to a piece of wood and swung it, and it made the bora sound, which is the resonance sound. And when that resonance sound appeared for the first time, the sun and the moon and the earth all started to move, and rivers started to flow, and people grew up, got old, and passed away, as did all other things. So the idea of wearing out your welcome, if you go and sit by a river, and there's a couple of really good rivers up the Yarra there, up there in Melbourne and everywhere. You go and sit by any river, you hear the water running over the rocks. That's the first sound of Bayami. The idea that he was sitting by the same thing, hearing the same sound. That's what makes it sort of actually, this is where we all belong. It's just that some of us have forgotten this is where we belong. We belong to country. It doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. And we've forgotten how to behave as people who belong somewhere. And belonging, staying still, is very, very boring, but it's also very, very rich. So the idea of that whole thing, of course, I didn't end up supervising that student because not having a Godhead that sits somewhere else, I really didn't qualify as an expert in that area. So looking at it, that idea of connection, it is true for everybody, regardless of who they are.
Thanks, Unc. And I just wanted to follow that by saying there is such generosity from Aboriginal people, and really, I've got a little story. We were showing that documentary on the colonisation of Gippsland down at Phillip Island, and there was a young non-Aboriginal girl. We would show the documentary, and then we would have a bit of a yarn afterwards. And so we had this panel discussion, and she was on the panel because she had been raised in a remote northern Aboriginal community, and was taken into that life. And she talked about one time when she was traveling back to where she grew up, and she looked like, she had the blonde hair, the blue eyes. She couldn't have been mistaken for anything other than a non-Aboriginal person. And she remembered there was this one time when she was traveling back, and she just knew, you had to walk, I think it was 5 days, she said, after you got off the transport. And she knew that she would have a bed, somewhere to stay along the way. And she spoke about 3 dialects, so she was really confident that she would be able to communicate with anybody that assisted her on the way. But she talked about this one time when an auntie took her in for the night, but they couldn't talk, they couldn't communicate. And when she got further, like when she got to her home, she sort of said, "Oh, they're really weird. This has never happened to me before. There was this auntie, and I couldn't speak her language. We couldn't converse. I knew that I was safe. She looked after me beautifully. It was all a wonderful thing. But like, how come I've never heard that language before?" And they said to her, "Oh, that would have been Auntie so and so. She's the last speaker of her language. Everybody else from her language group were massacred by." And she said, "Oh my gosh, they were massacred by people that probably looked quite similar to me, but she still took me in." And she just said, there's a certain number of rotations for the lighthouse light, and we reach out to more and more people each time, but don't ignore the generosity of Aboriginal people. And I think the way of not wearing out the welcome, and if you were to think about guests that you've had in your home that haven't been welcome, the people that don't appreciate what they've been given, people that don't use the socially accepted protocols that you both understand. So I think that the things that you can do not to wear out the welcome, because it's, as we were saying, it's all relational. So it's that, how do you be a good guest, or how do you be a good partner to the relationship? And if you don't understand the social dynamics, and it is very different, learn them.
Thank you so much, Alana, and thank you so much, Norm. And I know we've got lots more questions, and one burning question that someone's asked is around how we integrate this thinking into institutions. And I think we will be discussing that in our next event. Our next event is about how we embed long-term thinking in our politics and our democracies and in our democratic structures. So this is definitely something we'll be exploring throughout the entire series. So I hope that by the end of the series, we'll have answered that question. But for now, I think it's definitely time that we ended the event, unfortunately, because we don't want to take up any more time from our wonderful speakers who have so generously given their time tonight. So I just want to say an enormous thank you to Professor Norm Sheehan and to Alana Marsh for joining us today. I know that I have learned a lot, definitely a lot tonight, and there's a lot to sit with. And I imagine everyone in the audience is feeling quite the same way. So thank you both so much. And if you enjoyed the discussion today, I really encourage you to please join us for our next event, which will be in a fortnight's time on the 7th of October on Decolonising the Future, the Movement for Intergenerational Justice. and there'll be a link posted in the chat soon. So just before we go, if you want to unmute yourselves and just give a verbal goodbye, just to connect us across geographies and just to hear everyone's voices, that would be wonderful. So thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.